pendulum. Martin Avery had never ordered a clock. There had been no knock at the door, no delivery truck groaning away down the drive. Only the faint creak of his front gate opening sometime near dawn, followed by the gentle sound of something being set down on wood. When he stepped onto the porch later that morning, he found it there. A towering grandfather clock wrapped in fraying canvas and cinched tight with brittle rope. Its surface, though dulled by soot and age, still revealed hints of polished walnut beneath. It looked like something unearthed from an old estate. Not the sort of item one expected to find wedged between a potted fern and a sun-faded welcome mat in a modest Massachusetts home. Tucked into the gap beneath the clock's glass front panel was a single sheet of paper, typed in an antique serif font and unsigned. For the one who listens. Wind at dusk. Stand back. Do not interfere. Martin stood in the doorway, with the note in one hand, staring at the clock as though it might begin to speak. It was an elegant thing, though marked by a grim aesthetic. Nearly 7 feet tall, its black walnut casing rose into an arched crown where tiny brass moons had been carved along the wood. There was no maker's mark on the face, no brand or signature, just Roman numerals etched into bone-white enamel, and a pair of slender hands that curved slightly outward. Below the dial was a narrow glass window, and behind it, a pendulum hung still and centered, a long brass rod terminating in a polished disc. Though Martin had handled his share of antique restorations, he didn't recognize the craftsmanship. That more than anything else unsettled him. He had always admired the endurance of old things, vinyl records, brass tools, fountain pens with fading insignias. His garage shelves were filled with dog-eared books on furniture restoration, and he maintained a blog, sporadically updated, that traced the lineage of obscure artisans. But this clock felt like far more than a forgotten relic someone had tossed aside. After a few minutes of hesitation, he decided to bring it inside. It took nearly an hour to haul the thing from the porch to the far corner of his living room. The floor groaned beneath its weight with every inch of progress. Once upright, the clock seemed to lean ever so slightly forward, as if acknowledging his effort. Martin stepped back, wiped the sweat from his brow, and studied it from across the room. The temperature in the house had dropped. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to feel it along his arms and through the soles of his shoes. He blamed the exertion, poured himself a cup of coffee, and settled into his armchair with the note still crumpled in his palm. "Wind at dusk," he murmured, turning the words over like a riddle. His eyes drifted to the brass winding key, embedded neatly into a side panel. Old style, barrel shaft. Heavy. He waited until the sun began to set. Rust-colored light spilled across the floor as the sky shifted from gold to violet. Martin knelt beside the base of the clock and turned the key 3 times into the winding hole. The clock let out a low groan, metallic and distant. A moment later, the pendulum stirred. It rocked once, paused, and then began to swing in a smooth, steady rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Oddly, the hands on the dial remained still. Martin furrowed his brow. The pendulum moved with calm precision, but the time never advanced. He leaned closer, curious, and saw something unusual. The brass disc was not merely reflective. Its surface shimmered faintly, like the surface of water disturbed by the flicker of stars. The reflection it cast was warped at the edges, bending the room into curves that didn't align with the angles he knew. Tick, tock, tick. He stepped back and left it alone. That night, Martin dreamed of a hallway. He stood barefoot on a wooden floor in a corridor that resembled his own, but the dimensions were wrong. It stretched too far in either direction, and the ceiling hovered impossibly high overhead. There were no fixtures, only a diffuse amber glow that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, giving everything a gentle, unnatural warmth. He walked forward, his steps soundless. The corridor twisted in places, looping back and folding over itself. At one point, he passed a mirror. Expecting to see his reflection, he instead glimpsed the back of his own head. He spun around instinctively, but the hallway was empty. Yet the mirror still showed a figure just behind him. A tall, pale presence, with fingers like knotted wire. "Time is only forward because you believe it to be," it whispered. Martin awoke with a start and sat upright. Sweat clung to his back and collarbone. The house was quiet. The clock ticked faintly from the living room. He rose in the dark, drawn toward the sound. The pendulum still swayed in its steady arc. But now the hands on the dial had shifted. The time displayed was 11:08, earlier than when he had gone to sleep. Confused, he walked into the kitchen and checked the microwave clock. 41 a.m. He glanced between the two displays several times, searching for explanation. Then, with no warning, the pendulum came to a halt. He did not remember falling asleep again. When morning arrived, it felt abrupt. The coffee pot was full. A plate of cold eggs rested beside the stove. The newspaper lay open on the table, the crossword puzzle half completed in handwriting that didn't quite feel like his own. His phone showed a missed call from Angela. She'd left a voicemail, her voice uncertain. "Martin, it's almost 5, and I haven't seen you. You okay?" He stared at the screen. The time was 5:17 p.m. The date showed Tuesday, but the last thing he remembered was Sunday. He stood motionless by the counter, one hand braced against it to steady himself. A subtle dissonance permeated the house as though the walls were out of alignment with the floor. Every clock he checked, on the microwave, his phone, the mantle, displayed a different time. Only one continued ticking, and it moved in reverse. He returned to the living room. The grandfather clock's pendulum swayed gently. Its surface reflected not Martin, but the empty couch across from it. And just before he looked away, he saw something that froze him in place. In the pendulum's warped reflection, a version of himself lay asleep on that couch. But in the image, his eyes were open. Martin began writing everything down. He no longer trusted his phone's calendar, alarms, or digital notes. Instead, he retrieved a leather-bound journal that had gathered dust on a bookshelf and committed to documenting each day by hand. At first, his entries resembled a basic log. Meals prepared, calls returned, walks taken. He wrote in all capital letters, underlined the dates, and used blue ink in the morning, black at night, hoping the color distinction might help him detect lapses in memory or time. It didn't take long before the patterns revealed themselves. Entire mornings were missing from his records. Phone calls appeared in entries but left no trace in his call logs. One page described a trip to the grocery store, yet there was no receipt, no bags, and no recollection of what he had meant to buy. He began to suspect that even his careful documentation might be unreliable. Determined to gather proof beyond memory, he purchased a motion-activated indoor security system with automatic backups to a local drive. He mounted the cameras in strategic corners of the living room, the hallway, the kitchen, and, most importantly, directly facing the grandfather clock. That evening, just after sunset, he wound the mechanism again. The pendulum resumed its backward motion, a slow and steady arc visible from the corner of his eye as he checked the camera overlays and verified the timestamps. By morning, what he found on the footage did not resemble a simple glitch. The files remained intact. No gaps in duration, no loss of data. Yet certain segments had been visually corrupted in ways that defied explanation. Instead of static, the screen flickered with reversed motion. Martin walking backward across the room, mouthing words no longer audible. In one clip, he stood before the clock, opened its glass face, and extended his hand, not to touch the pendulum but to pass through it. His fingers met no resistance. The brass disc swung on, undisturbed. He reviewed the same clip 3 times, scrutinizing each frame. On the third viewing, he noticed the pendulum's reflection again, and this time, his mirrored self smiled. Angela visited that afternoon. She brought lemon muffins in a small tin and a borrowed shovel rattling in the trunk of her car. Her plan had been simple: reinforce a sagging corner of the garden fence and rope Martin into helping. But the moment she stepped inside, her expression changed. "Has your hallway always been that long?" she asked, pausing near the entryway. Martin blinked, unsure how to respond. She gestured toward the back of the house, where the corridor led past the living room into the narrower stretch that connected to the bedrooms. From his perspective, nothing appeared unusual, but now that she mentioned it, the ceiling did seem taller than he remembered, and the linen closet halfway down the hall had a knot in the wood that looked unfamiliar. "There's a door past the bathroom, isn't there?" Angela continued. "That one wasn't there last week." Martin stepped forward, prepared to reassure her, but as he turned the corner and looked toward the spot she indicated, his words faltered. A tall, narrow door had appeared in the wall just beyond the bathroom. It had no handle, only a small, keyhole-shaped recess, an inverted teardrop set into the wood. He approached slowly. With each step, something in his chest tightened. When he pressed his palm to the door, it felt cold and faintly damp, like aged stone rather than timber. Angela called his name from the living room. He turned to respond. By the time he looked back, the door had vanished. The wall was unbroken once again, its surface intact, but subtly rippled. Later that evening, the ticking resumed. Martin sat on the couch with a lukewarm mug of chamomile tea, a book forgotten in his lap. The clock remained unwound. Its hands were frozen, its pendulum still, and yet from somewhere within the house, a soft rhythmic tick-tick-tick echoed through the quiet. It began behind the kitchen wall, barely audible. Then it shifted, climbing upward toward the ceiling. Martin followed the sound, pressing his ear to walls, crouching beside cabinets, checking behind furniture and into the crawl space beneath the stairs. At times, the ticking stopped when he approached. Other times, it grew louder. He turned on every light in the house and walked the room slowly, listening. When he returned to the hallway, he paused. It looked longer again. The baseboards along one wall no longer matched those on the opposite side. A recessed ceiling light had been joined by a second fixture. The mirror above the side table showed an open doorway, though none existed behind him. He took a cautious step forward. In the reflection, he did not move. At some point that night, the hallway dead-ended. There should not have been a wall where he stood. The house had no such layout. Yet the corridor ahead curved subtly inward, its walls pressing together. The floor dipped slightly, warped and uneven. The air smelled faintly of varnish and damp earth. Martin pressed his hand against the wall at the end. It gave slightly under pressure, as if stretched fabric concealed something hollow beneath. He returned to the kitchen to retrieve his phone, intending to take a photograph. But when he came back, the hallway ended at the laundry room, just as it always had. The warped walls were gone. The scent had vanished. A faint trail of dryer sheet fragrance lingered instead. He stood for a long time in front of the linen shelf, uncertain which version of the hallway had come first. That night's dream chilled him. He stood in a vast subterranean chamber surrounded by smooth, dark stone that shimmered with moisture. Overhead, a pendulum the size of a lamppost swung slowly through the air. Its disc was enormous, bronze, circular, easily 6 feet across, and it moved with serene momentum, suspended by a cable that extended beyond sight. Below, an abyss yawned, open. Martin stood on the ledge, barefoot, the stone beneath him cold and uneven. Each swing of the pendulum sent a gust of air across his skin. A whisper sounded behind him, clear, low, unmistakable. "It is not the body that wears down," said a voice, "but the world that winds down around it." Martin turned, searching for the source. There was no figure to be seen, only a long shadow extending toward him across the stone. He awoke, gasping. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. The house was silent. The clock ticked, and the hallway, he noticed, seemed longer still. The discovery occurred by accident. He had been inspecting the clock's housing, searching for damage, misaligned, gears or signs of rot. While removing the side panel, his fingers found a hidden seam near the interior framework. Pressing gently, he revealed a shallow compartment tucked behind the chimes. Inside rested a small leather booklet, hand-stitched and worn from age. The cover bore no title. Its spine had cracked from repeated use. The contents, however, were anything but mundane. The pages contained diagrams of mechanical systems, though many bore little resemblance to standard horological design. Some schematics appeared anatomical, gears intertwined with skeletal structures, ribs replaced by escapements, vertebrae fused to coiled springs. Other pages displayed mirrored lettering, as well as passages written in Latin, reverti ad originem. Corpus est horologium, decay is the lie. One drawing showed a segmented circle labeled in multiple languages, the mirrored veil, the breathless machine, the quiet passage. Another depicted a clock face with no hands, only a gaping void at its center. From that void, dark ink spilled outward, covering the page. Martin stared at the illustrations for over an hour. A numb sensation crept through his limbs as he flipped the pages. The symbols felt less foreign the longer he looked at them. Not newly learned, but remembered. His phone buzzed with a message. Angela. Hey, just checking in. You okay? Been a few days. Martin glanced at the date. It was Friday. He remembered. Tuesday in fragments. Wednesday was a haze. Thursday had vanished entirely. Across the room, the pendulum swung. The texts Angela received didn't sound like Martin. She met him at the edge of her gravel driveway on a Saturday evening, just as the light began to thin, behind the tree line. The sun cast fractured shadows across the road, and Martin stood with his arms loosely at his sides, blinking as though he had just awakened. Angela couldn't tell whether he was confused or simply exhausted. When she asked how many days it had been since they last spoke, he hesitated. I remember the muffins, he said finally. I remember standing in the hallway. After that, not much. Angela pulled out her phone and scrolled through the message thread. These came from your number at 3 a.m. Wednesday morning, she told him, holding out the screen. Martin glanced at it and frowned. The texts were long and erratic, paragraphs stacked in a spiral of fractured syntax. Phrases leapt out. Found. The fulcrum. The air folds backward in the veined spaces. Unbecoming is the path. He's watching through the brass. Dozens more followed, filled with references to diagrams and bone gears, some words repeated in mirrored form. I don't remember sending anything, he said, his voice dry. I didn't write this. Angela watched him carefully. Martin, something's wrong. I think you need to get out of that house, even just for a night. He opened his mouth to respond, but the moment fractured. Her voice seemed to recede, as if she were calling to him from underwater. The warmth of the sun drained from his skin. A breeze stirred the dust between them, colder than the season should have allowed. For an instant he caught the reflection of her phone's screen in the mirrored lens of her sunglasses, not showing the message thread but his own face, blank and unmoving. He turned and walked home without saying goodbye. That night, Martin reviewed the hallway camera. Nothing about the angle had changed. The timestamp, however, displayed a string of sevens, 070707, followed by a blinking colon and no minutes. He fast-forwarded through several nights' worth of footage, watching familiar static give way to the unnerving motion of his own, body performing unfamiliar actions. There he was at 2:13 a.m. on Thursday, walking toward the hallway. He stopped in front of the wall where the door had once appeared. Without hesitation, he reached out. The wall parted. A darkened doorway yawned open. He stepped inside and vanished into the black. The video continued for 3 hours. Nothing else occurred. Then, without warning, the footage reversed. Not a rewind, but a seamless reversal. Time unstitched itself naturally. Martin's figure reappeared, walking backward through the doorway. The door, which had not visibly closed, now undid itself with eerie grace. When he turned toward the camera, he looked directly into the lens and began to speak. His mouth moved continuously, forming a single, unbroken phrase. Martin replayed the segment 6 times. Each playback revealed a different sentence. Each one was in his own voice. The next morning, Martin disassembled the clock. With a precision bordering on reverence, he laid each piece across the kitchen table. He marked and numbered every gear, every pin, every fine wire, comparing each part against the schematics in the leather booklet. What he found defied logic. Nested gear clusters rotated on invisible axes. Hair-thin arms held impossible weights without tension. One component floated between two pivot points with no visible means of support. Another appeared to contain overlapping, rings etched with symbols that glowed faintly under the flicker of candlelight. And behind the secondary strike gear, he found the teeth. At first, he assumed they were fragments of ivory, but when he ran his fingers along the ridged edge, he recognized the unmistakable texture of enamel. 32 teeth had been arranged around a rotating disc, each one engraved with a separate glyph from the booklet. The disc did not connect to any chime mechanism. It did not regulate time. It simply rotated at the pace of the pendulum, slow, silent, and smooth. When he touched the edge, the disc pulsed. It was faint, but undeniably organic. Martin stared at it until his eyes burned. Somewhere during that time, he realized he had begun whispering. The words he spoke were unfamiliar, but they left his mouth with ease. Angela had stopped waiting. She contacted a retired religious historian named Terence Wexley after scouring old local archives and forgotten corners of the internet. His name had appeared in a fringe blog on esoteric American cults, and she left a voicemail detailing what little she knew. Martin's fixation, the strange clock, the shifting house, the language from the texts. He agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop just outside of Amherst. After listening carefully to her account, Wexley handed her a photocopied newspaper clipping from the late 19th century. The article was brief and badly faded, but the headline was still legible: "The Death Reversal Society Exposed." The article described a cult based in western Massachusetts that had flourished briefly in the early 1870s. Its founder was known only as the Clockmaker, a man who claimed to have constructed a device capable of unwinding the soul from the body and reversing its path through time. Members of the sect practiced rituals involving precision timekeeping, reflective surfaces, and biomechanical augmentation. The cult disbanded after the Clockmaker disappeared, though some followers claimed he had been drawn into the work. Angela left 3 voicemails for Martin that evening. He answered none. The next night, she stood on his porch, staring through the front window. The curtains were mostly drawn, but enough light spilled through the gap to reveal the living room. The walls looked distorted as if viewed through water. The furniture was arranged in a mirrored layout, bookshelves reversed, paintings flipped, spines facing the wrong direction. Most notably, the grandfather clock was gone. Angela opened the door. It was unlocked. The house greeted her with an unnatural quiet, the kind that clings to places left uninhabited too long. Pale sunlight filtered through the blinds, striping the floor in shadowed bars. She stepped inside and paused. The hallway had changed, its walls bowed inward in a gentle but unmistakable arc. The floor no longer creaked. The sconces along the walls were unlit, but emitted a dim glow, just enough to illuminate her path. She called Martin's name twice, her voice absorbed by the stillness. Each room she entered bore subtle distortions. The kitchen table had only one chair. The mugs in the cupboard were stacked upside down. The bathroom mirror reflected an image that seemed too deep, as though revealing a longer hallway than the one behind her. In the living room, she found the DVR system for the security cameras. The monitor blinked to life after a moment of delay. She queued up the final available footage marked from 3 nights prior. At 2:09 a.m., Martin appeared on screen. He approached the same hallway doorway that had opened before. This time, he did not hesitate. The door accepted him. He stepped through. For nearly an hour, the video displayed nothing but an empty corridor. Then, at precisely 3:03 a.m., the recording began to reverse. It did not rewind. It moved backward, naturally, like time undoing itself. Martin emerged from the door, walking in perfect reverse. The door followed, opening on its own. When he turned to face the camera, he looked directly into the lens. Angela froze the frame. His eyes stared back at her, wide and unblinking, but they were no longer his. Martin awoke to the sound of the pendulum ringing through the walls. He opened. his eyes and found himself lying on the floor, not in his living room but in the center of the hallway. Overhead, lights flickered softly. The clock's face had been embedded directly into the end wall, like a tumor, as though it had grown. There, the walls had softened. They curved organically, their texture closer to flesh than plaster. Pictures hung on the walls, scenes he recognized from vacations, antique barns, lakesides, trails through Vermont. But each one had been subtly altered. Roads arched upward, trees leaned at impossible angles, water curved in impossible directions. He stood slowly, disoriented but aware. In the hallway mirror, his reflection stared back at him. At first glance, the image seemed accurate, but when he raised his right hand, the reflection lifted its left. It blinked when he did not. It smiled, without provocation. Behind the glass, the pendulum continued to swing, its motion unbroken, though no clock remained visible. With each arc, a faint sound emerged, like wind trapped in a well. He blinked once. The hallway extended. Angela knocked 3 times before trying the door. It opened without resistance. The house stood in perfect silence, illuminated by slanted beams of sunlight diffused through closed blinds. At first glance, nothing seemed overtly disturbed. But the longer she stood just inside the threshold, the more she noticed the subtle wrongness of the space. Everything had been reversed. The couch was mirrored along its axis. The bookshelf held the same volumes, but their order had flipped, their spines facing the wrong direction. Even the framed artwork on the walls had been inverted. Letters in the signatures appeared backward. The images themselves seemed stretched, in unfamiliar directions like reflections in warped glass. The grandfather clock was missing. Angela stepped deeper into the room. When she turned toward the hallway, she stopped cold. The hallway had changed again. The walls bowed inward with a gentle curvature, as if the space had been molded rather than built. The floor no longer creaked beneath her feet. Though no visible lights were present, the sconces that lined the passage emitted a low amber glow. Their steady illumination revealed details she didn't remember. The beveled edges of the trim, a ripple in the wallpaper, a door frame that hadn't existed before. She called Martin's name. Once. Then again. No reply came. The stillness in the house wasn't peaceful. It had the quality of air sealed in a vacuum, dry, faintly metallic, and lifeless. A scent lingered just beneath the surface, bringing to mind old copper shavings or the static edge of ozone. In the kitchen, she noticed that every coffee mug had been turned upside down. The table, set for one, bore no utensils. She turned away from the room and found the monitor for Martin's DVR system still powered on. The security feed blinked twice before displaying a menu. She selected the most recent footage. The timestamp flickered briefly, then resolved into clarity. The screen showed Martin entering the hallway at exactly 2:09 a.m. He walked toward the end of the corridor and stopped in front of a door. It was the same one she had seen appear and vanish. This time it stood open. Martin stepped inside without hesitation. The door closed behind him, not with a slam, but as though unwinding itself into place. For nearly an hour, nothing changed, on the feed. Then at 3:03 a.m., the hallway began to move backward. The recording did not rewind in the traditional sense. The events simply reversed their trajectory, naturally and fluidly. Time did not skip. It turned inside out. Martin emerged from the doorway, walking backward into the hall. The door followed suit, retracting open in a way that defied normal mechanics. As he returned to the center of the hallway, Martin turned and looked into the camera. Angela paused the frame. Something in his gaze unsettled her. The face was his. The body, unmistakably his. But the eyes no longer belonged to the man she knew. They had become too still, too clear, like glass lenses, housing something mechanical behind them. Elsewhere, Martin awoke to the sound of the pendulum. It was the first noise he had heard in what felt like days. When he opened his eyes, he found himself lying in the hallway, though it bore no resemblance to the one in his home. The walls here were smooth and rounded, almost organic in construction. They curved without angles. The ceiling arched in a gentle dome above him, and the lights embedded in the walls buzzed faintly, emitting a dim, blue-tinged glow. At the far end of the corridor, where a door should have been, the face of the clock was embedded directly into the surface. It had no casing, no hands, just the pendulum, suspended in motionless arc, anchored by nothing. He stood slowly and examined the images that lined the hallway walls. Each frame held a photograph or painting of a place he recognized: scenes from childhood road trips, backcountry trails, a lakeside cabin in New Hampshire. But each one was subtly corrupted. Forests bent upward into the sky. Water curled unnaturally across the page. Barns appeared to lean away from their foundations, caught mid-collapse in reverse. Martin turned to face the mirror beside him. At first, the image reflected exactly what it should: a man standing alone in an unfamiliar corridor, his face pale, his shirt clinging damply to his frame. Then the reflection blinked, but Martin had not. When he raised his right hand, the figure in the mirror lifted its left. It smiled faintly, even as Martin's own mouth remained still. Behind the glass, the pendulum continued to swing. He saw no mechanism, no casing, only the brass disc tracing a steady arc, slicing across something deeper than air. Each swing accompanied a faint hum, as if drawing resonance from the walls themselves. He blinked, and the hallway lengthened. Time began to reverse around him. The changes were subtle at first. The window beside the hallway grew brighter even as the sky outside darkened. Dust on the sills vanished. Scratches in the floor unformed. In the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee returned. Plates reassembled their contents. A mug filled itself, steaming faintly. The murmur of a conversation rose in the distance, then unraveled into silence. Martin moved carefully through it all, untouched by the changes, walking in the calm eye of the storm. Through the living room window, he watched the world unmake itself. Across the street, Angela's car reversed into her driveway. Moving boxes reassembled themselves into neat stacks, only to vanish entirely. The house she had moved into reset to vacancy. Her silhouette passed through the windows in reverse, becoming fainter with each step. Voices he had once known drifted in and then disappeared, syllables retreating into closed mouths, laughter receding into unspoken memory. He stood in his kitchen and opened the cabinet where he kept his journals. Each notebook sat pristine, untouched. The leather bindings bore faint indentations, remnants of wear that no longer connected to any written content. The pages inside were white, unmarked. The ink had not been erased. It had never existed. In the hallway, the mirror called to him again. He approached it slowly. This time, his reflection did not mirror his movements. The figure on the other side had changed. It no longer mimicked. It observed. The face resembled his own, but only in outline. The skin had taken on a pale, stretched quality. The eyes gleamed, their hands spinning gently in reverse. A brass key protruded from the sternum of the reflection, turning slowly. No hand touched it. The figure smiled. "You have wound it well," the reflection said. "Now you are the winding key." Martin looked down and lifted his shirt. A keyhole had been set into his chest. It did not bleed. It did not ache. It looked as though it had always been there. Perhaps it had. Behind him, the pendulum reached its apex. Somewhere else, a package arrived. It sat quietly on a doorstep, wrapped in weathered canvas and bound in twine. A brass label had been affixed near the top, its surface tarnished but still legible. No return address had been listed, no tracking number, only a note, typed in an antique font and tucked beneath the edge of the front panel. For the one who listens, wind at dusk, stand back, do not interfere. The family inside never heard the gate open. They never noticed the shape standing just beyond the hedges, outlined by the porch light but too far to resolve. They did not see the figure place the package gently at the door, nor did they hear the faint hum of gears retreating into stillness. But the youngest daughter, crouched at the keyhole with one eye pressed to the frame, caught a glimpse of the brass disc just before it vanished. Reflected within it, a man stood alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes spinning counterclockwise. In the center of his chest, a key turned slowly against the grain of time. The Marionette hour. Cal never remembered falling asleep anymore. Mornings came without warning, abrupt and indifferent, as if someone had flipped a switch in the middle of a dream he couldn't recall. He'd surface slowly to the sputtering, rattle of the window fan grinding in its rusted frame, or the chill of air curling through the gaps in the siding, dragging him up from a depth he didn't choose to leave. That morning began like the others, except something felt off. The air carried the usual scent of sawdust, but beneath it lingered a sharper odor, something acrid and faintly metallic. Varnish, maybe, or oil that had warmed too long in the sun. He stared at the ceiling, letting the ache in his knees settle before sitting up. When he reached for his glasses, his hand swept a half-empty pill bottle off the nightstand. It clattered to the floor, spinning briefly before toppling over. He slipped the glasses on with a sigh. The world came back into focus, and with it, a quiet nausea rose in his gut. They had moved again. 6 puppets stood arranged in a semicircle near the workshop sink, their limbs contorted into unnatural poses. They lacked strings, yet each figure had been frozen mid-gesture, as though someone had interrupted a performance and left the cast suspended in silence. One had its jaw extended unnaturally, the head twisted until its chin nearly pointed backward. Another knelt with its legs folded awkwardly, one arm lifted toward the ceiling as if seeking revelation in a room without answers. Cal stiffened. He hadn't touched them since Wednesday. He was sure of it. He rose carefully, stepping over the Marionette that blocked his doorway. It was one of his older models, carved from cypress and dressed in a worn conductor's cap. Its hands had been repositioned, palms up, resting beside its torso as though it had been offering something, or asking for mercy. He lifted it and set it gently on the hallway bench, brushing off none of the dust clinging to its back. His slippers made no sound as he shuffled to the kitchenette, each motion governed more by muscle memory than purpose. Kettle on, mug retrieved, instant coffee, 1 spoon of sugar, 2, because the day already felt wrong. By the time he returned to the studio with the chipped mug, he couldn't avoid looking at them. The puppets. They looked even more lifeless than usual when arranged this way, like mute spectators daring him to remember whether he had placed them there himself. He'd grown used to small lapses. Keys in the freezer, lights left on. Age had been whittling away at his short-term memory for years. Still, this felt different. This felt orchestrated. He turned his back on them and fixed his gaze on the shelf of tools above the bench. He needed something repetitive, something familiar, something to occupy his hands and pull his focus away from the quiet nausea growing beneath his ribs. That was when the doorbell rang. The sound jolted him. His grip on the mug tightened, nearly slipping. Visitors had become rare and the bell hadn't worked properly in months. It buzzed when pressed, a choking stutter instead of a chime. He walked slowly to the front door and peered through the peephole. Janine, of course. He unlatched the locks and opened the door halfway. "You picked a hell of a time." Janine raised a brow. "I texted you yesterday. Twice. Still using that brick of a phone?" "I charged it last week." "That explains it." She brushed past him into the house, carrying a grocery bag in one hand. "You look like hell, by the way." Cal closed the door and relocked it, more out of habit than anything else. "Nice to see you, too." She didn't answer right away. She set the bag on the counter, pulled out 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, and a 6-pack of something organic that promised better sleep. "You eating anything that doesn't require a tetanus shot?" He scratched at the stubble on his chin. "Define expired." She gave him a look. "You smell like turpentine in midlife crisis." "I've been working." "That what you call it?" She nodded toward the studio. "I saw the freak show on my way in." Cal's jaw tensed. "They weren't like that when I went to bed." "Oh, great. Haunted puppets now." I'm serious. She crossed her arms. Cal, you need sleep. The kind where you don't wake up wondering who arranged your dolls for a seance. He ran a hand through his graying hair and sighed. I don't think it's just that. Janine's expression shifted. She studied him more closely, her eyes narrowing. You haven't had another one of those fugue episodes, have you? No. Because you're not exactly convincing me otherwise. I've been locking the doors, avoiding the studio at night. I even left myself a note. And the note was gone the next morning, replaced with a sketch. Janine hesitated. A sketch of what? He crossed the room and opened a drawer near the window. Inside sat a yellowed napkin, torn at one corner. He handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it and recoiled slightly. Jesus. The drawing looked like something scrawled by a child with a heavy hand. One of his puppets knelt beside a sleeping man. Dangling from the puppet's wooden fingers was a smaller marionette, its strings held above the man's chest. I didn't draw that, Cal said quietly. Janine folded the napkin again, tighter this time. You need help. I need answers. From what? A bunch of haunted plywood? He didn't respond. The silence stretched until Janine broke it with a sigh. Look, maybe it's stress. Or maybe your meds are messing with your sleep. But I don't like where this is going. I set up a camera last night, he said. What kind? Old camcorder, motion activated, it's still recording. You haven't checked it? Not yet, I don't know if I want to. You're afraid of your own footage? I'm afraid it'll make sense. She stepped back, placing her hands on her hips. Okay. I've got a shift in an hour, but tomorrow I'm coming back. We'll watch it together. Sound good? Cal nodded. And until then, don't go carving yourself any new friends, all right? He managed a faint smile. No promises. She kissed his forehead before heading for the door, and then paused. One more thing. What? That big one in the glass case. I thought you got rid of him. Cal stiffened. I didn't. Well, he's not in the case anymore. He turned to the studio. The display that once held Mr. Wiggles now stood open, the glass door hanging slightly ajar. I never opened it, he said. Janine met his eyes, her voice lower now. Then you'd better hope you're sleepwalking. Because if you're not... She didn't finish the sentence. The door closed behind her. Cal stood staring at the empty case, unmoving. The camera hadn't moved. Cal had checked it twice already, but each time he returned to the studio, it remained exactly where he had left it. Mounted on a rusted tripod in the far corner, aimed toward the workbench and the rows of puppets lined up beneath the shelves. The LED light blinked steadily. The tape was full. He hesitated, then reached forward and pressed rewind. The camcorder whirred, its internal gears rasping faintly in the stillness. He sat down in the nearest chair, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound the house made in its silence. The faint wheeze of the floorboards beneath him, the mechanical hum of the fridge beyond the doorway, the whisper of tree branches brushing against the boarded-up window. When the tape reached its beginning, he pressed play. At first, only static filled the screen, followed by a grayscale image of the studio bathed in the harsh contrast of the infrared lens. The cluttered shelves and workbench glowed in pale shades of white, while deeper shadows pooled in the corners. At 10:03 p.m., he watched himself shuffle into frame, switch off the lights, and retreat toward the bedroom. The room remained perfectly still for hours afterward, motionless and untouched, until 2:37 a.m. The timestamp changed. Something moved. At first, it appeared as a flicker near the edge of the frame, just a shadow. But then the figure became clearer. It was him. Or something wearing his face. Cal watched, unmoving, as the doppelganger stepped into the frame with a stiff, unnatural gait. Its bare feet dragged slightly on the hardwood. Its head hung at an awkward tilt, jaw loose, arms limp at its sides. When it reached the center of the room, it raised both arms slowly, as if conducting a silent performance. One by one, the puppets responded. They didn't snap upright or spring into motion. Instead, they were guided, lifted by something unseen, their limbs pulled gently into place. One puppet was dragged across the floor and posed on the bench in a cruciform sprawl. Another was placed in the rafters by the window, suspended by its own cords, and left to spin slowly. Throughout it all, the version of Cal on the screen remained silent, his eyes glassy and unfocused, his body swaying in rhythm with some invisible current. The timestamp flickered again. 12 a.m. Now all the puppets had been positioned. Their stances were expressive but nonsensical, frozen mid-action in some surreal, unknowable drama. Without warning, the figure turned to face the camera. It smiled. The screen erupted in static. Cal lunged forward, paused the tape, and then rewound. He scrubbed backward frame by frame until the moment the intruder entered the studio. Every movement repeated itself in grim silence. The thing drifted across the floor, gently animating the puppets as though born to the role. The footage offered no explanations, only deeper confusion. The longer he stared, the more distant he felt from the man on the screen. He stopped the tape and pushed himself up from the chair. His hands trembled. He crossed the hallway in 3 unstable strides and threw open the bedroom door. His sheets were undisturbed. The pillows sat exactly where he had left them. On the dresser opposite the bed, the second camcorder still blinked red, its light steady. He approached, rewound the tape, and pressed play. This footage showed him sleeping, all night. His body remained still, nestled beneath the covers, unbothered and unmoving. He watched himself lie there with mouth slack and chest rising in slow rhythmic intervals. The timestamp matched the hours from the first tape. There had been no sleepwalking, no midnight excursions. He watched the footage again, then a third time. He searched the shadows for movement, any subtle twitch of a limb or flicker of light. That might suggest he had left the bed, but there was nothing. And yet on the other tape, a chill ran along his arms. He reached for the thermostat and saw it still read 68 degrees, though the air had turned sharply cold. A draft curled under the doorframe. Then he saw the blood. A thin, dried trail marked the inside of his forearm, starting just below the elbow and descending in narrow lines toward his wrist. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing 3 shallow scratches etched into the skin. Each was curved and evenly spaced, as though carved by something small but precise. He felt no pain. He stumbled into the kitchen, disoriented. The microwave clock read 9:02 a.m. He returned to the studio and pressed play on the first camcorder, but the footage had changed. Instead of static, the screen now displayed a frozen image, his own face, pressed close to the lens. His eyes stared half-lidded and dull, the expression vacant. He pressed the eject button. Nothing happened. He powered the camcorder off. The screen remained lit. He pulled the plug from the wall. Still, the image remained. He took a step back, watching, in disbelief as the image began to recede. It zoomed out, not with any mechanical function he recognized, but as if something behind the screen were pulling away from him. The room came back into view. Only the puppets were no longer in their previous positions. Each one had turned. They were facing him. With a gasp, he swatted the camcorder off the table. It crashed to the floor and shattered, shards of plastic skittering across the wood. Yet the room remained silent. No sparks, no smoke, only the crackle of broken plastic in the silence. Then he heard something shift above him. He looked up. "Mister." Wiggles perched on the crossbeam overhead. Cal hadn't placed him there. He knew that much. The puppet's limbs hung loosely, bent at unnatural angles that suggested flexibility far beyond what Cal had built. Its porcelain face cracked along. The left side gazed down at him with wide, unblinking eyes. The button pupils seemed aligned with uncanny precision, as though sight were a possibility. There were no strings. Still, it held its place. Cal backed away, stopping just short of the hallway. The bedroom door had opened. He had closed it earlier. He was certain. Faint static drifted from within. He nudged the door with his foot. It creaked inward, revealing an emptied space. Both camcorders were gone. The tripod had fallen sideways. Drawers were pulled open. The bedspread had been twisted into a grotesque shape resembling a marionette. Its limbs formed from pillows, its face crudely stitched with black thread into a mocking caricature. A square of white paper jutted from the flannel shirt draped. Over its chest, he pulled it free. Another drawing. The lines were childlike again, drawn with heavy pressure. This one depicted a man suspended by strings held aloft by 4 puppets. Each bore Cal's face. Above them, in the corner of the page, a 5th figure loomed, featureless and tall, with no eyes and only hands. He dropped the paper and fled the room. The kitchen light flickered when he entered. He flipped the switch off and then back on. The fridge gave a weak hum before falling silent again. He checked the clock. Still 9:02 a.m. He stopped in place. Something in his chest tightened. Not pain, but a kind of internal bracing, like his body understood something before his mind could process it. He unlocked the front door and opened it, desperate for daylight. But the world outside had turned to night. There were no street lamps, no porch, lights from the neighbors, not even the sound of crickets or wind. Only a thick, unnatural darkness stretching in every direction. He slammed the door shut and turned to face the hallway. A figure stood at the far end. It was him, or something, wearing him. Its posture mirrored his own, but the expression was wrong. The head tilted slightly to one side, as if examining him with detached amusement. The mouth stretched into a grin that felt practiced. The lights dimmed, and the hallway vanished into shadow. Janine returned 2 days later. At least she believed it had been 2 days. Her phone confirmed the date, but the moment she stepped inside Cal's house, time no longer felt trustworthy. A film of dust coated every surface. The air inside had grown uncomfortably warm, too much for early October, as if someone had cranked the heat and forgotten to adjust it. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, not from age alone, but with a kind of protest, as though reluctant to bear weight again. She called his name once from the kitchen, then again as she moved down the hallway, but got no response. The studio door stood ajar. That was new. She pushed it open and stopped. The puppets had been rearranged. They now stood unaided, balanced in positions that defied gravity and intention. One sat on the bench with its legs dangling, head tilted slightly downward. Another stood, poised on tiptoe near the closet door, its face turned as though eavesdropping. In the center of the room, occupying the brightest circle of light from the overhead lamp, sat Mr. Wiggles. Janine stared. The puppet wore its usual dusty red vest and frayed bow tie. Its cracked porcelain face reflected just enough light to exaggerate its expression, which was neither smiling nor neutral, but something else, an intent that was not its own. Though the arms hung limply at its sides, the posture seemed deliberate, as though it had been waiting. "Cal," she called again. From the bedroom came a rasp, rough and low. "Back here." She followed the sound and found him on the floor. His eyes were red and bleary, his cheeks smeared with ink. He hadn't shaved. His hands trembled as she helped him sit upright. "You've been sleeping on the floor?" "I don't sleep," he replied. Janine frowned and looked him over more carefully. "You're bleeding again." He followed her gaze and lifted his left hand. Thin cuts marked the back of it, shallow parallel lines that looked as though they'd been made by twine or wire. "I didn't do it," he said. "I haven't even entered the studio. I've been locking the door, hiding the keys." "They're unlocked now." Cal nodded, but not in agreement. It was more like a gesture of resignation. "They unlock themselves." Janine narrowed her eyes. "That's not how locks work." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she noticed something had changed in his expression. It wasn't exhaustion, though that lingered in his posture. It wasn't fear either. What she saw was something hollowed out, a recognition of something beyond his control. "I need to show you the tape," he said. They returned to the studio. He loaded the footage with fingers that barely responded to his commands. The camcorder still functioned, despite the visible damage to its casing. One side had cracked and several buttons were unresponsive, but it still recognized power. A tangled mess of flash drives covered the workbench. He sorted through them until he found the most recent. Janine watched in silence as he inserted it into a USB hub. The file opened on the laptop. The video began with the same static grayscale framing. The studio at night, pale and infrared. The furniture appeared spectral beneath the lens, and nothing moved for several minutes. Then the shadows thickened, darkness gathering in the corners until it took shape, and one at a time the puppets began to lift. There were no strings. They rose like bodies in water as though buoyed by something unseen. Mr. Wiggles moved first. His arms raised slowly in a gesture that resembled invocation. The others followed, a dozen in total. They turned in unison, all facing the closed door to Cal's bedroom. Then he entered the frame. Janine leaned forward. "Is that you?" Cal remained silent. The figure resembled him. It wore his clothes and moved like someone mimicking a familiar rhythm. But its proportions were subtly wrong. The neck appeared too long, the limbs too rigid, and the face, though nearly identical, held no spark of recognition. Its expression was flat, like a mask that had forgotten how to animate emotion. The figure raised both arms. The puppets danced. There was no grace in their movement. Their limbs jerked and twisted in sharp, erratic motion, snapping into place like broken clockwork. One puppet's leg rotated unnaturally, bending backward at the knee until the joint cracked with visible stress. Janine flinched. The figure paused. Its head rotated toward the camera. It smiled. The smile matched Cal's in shape, but not in meaning. The eyes were different. Then the screen went black. Janine pressed her palms together, trying to still the tremor in her fingers. "That wasn't a loop." "No," Cal said. "That wasn't a dream. Or sleepwalking. Or some kind of episode. I told you." She turned to him. "How many of these have you watched?" "All of them," he said quietly. "They're never the same. Every time I play one, something changes. The puppets are arranged differently. Sometimes a few are missing. Sometimes I'm not the one in the video." Her voice dropped. "What are you saying?" "I think the tapes are lying." Janine stared at him. "Lying how?" He stood and walked slowly to the closet. Beneath a pile of cloth and broken marionette parts, he pulled out a thick sketch pad and returned to the desk. Every page was filled. He opened it and flipped through the drawings. Each one depicted a different layout of the studio. In some, the puppets gathered around a single chair. In others, they climbed the walls or hung upside down from the rafters. One showed Cal himself suspended from the ceiling by the same strings he had used on them. "I started sketching what I saw after each tape," he explained, "trying to keep track of what was real and what changed. I thought if I documented it, I could prove something, or at least see a pattern." Janine turned to the final page. It was mostly blank. Only one line had been written near the center. In tight, angular script, "The show must go on." She stepped back from the desk. "You think you're being made to perform. I know I am. And these changes, what are they? Rewrites?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Call it direction." She glanced toward the camcorder. Its recording light blinked red. "You need to leave this house," she said. "Stay with me for a few days. I can call one of my colleagues, someone who specializes in parasomnias and disassociation. Maybe it's something neurological. We can rule that out before." "I can't leave," he said flatly. "It follows me." Her expression darkened. "What does that mean?" "I went out last week just to get sleep aids. I thought if I broke the pattern it might stop, but when I came back the puppets had moved again. That night I checked the front-facing camera on my phone. And I was in the back seat." Janine froze. "That isn't possible." "Nothing about this is." He moved toward the far corner of the room where Mr. Wiggles still sat beneath the lamp. The puppet remained motionless, its cracked face catching just enough light to reflect a distorted smile. "Last night," Cal said, "I dreamed I was him." Janine took a step closer. "What do you mean?" "I was inside his body, not like a costume. Like I was watching from behind his eyes. I couldn't move, but I felt him moving me. Like he was the puppeteer, and I was the puppet." He turned toward her. His voice had dropped to a whisper, hoarse and dry, and I could hear myself screaming. She reached for his arm. "Cal, please. You're not safe here. Come with me. Just for a night or two. We'll figure this out. Together." He hesitated, then nodded once. "All right." Janine exhaled. Relief passed over her face. "But before I go," he added, "I want to watch one more tape." Cal insisted on watching the final tape alone. Janine argued at first. She offered to sit beside him to keep him grounded in something real. But he refused. He explained, not unkindly, that whatever was happening had already warped the edges of reality. If someone else remained in the room while he watched, he feared the truth might be diluted, reshaped to accommodate the presence of a witness. He needed to see it clearly, even if it meant seeing something he couldn't unsee. He waited until the house fell quiet again, until Janine had packed a small bag for him and stepped outside to take a call. Then he returned to the studio, loaded the tape, and pressed play. The screen remained black for several seconds. There was no timestamp, no static, no grainy flicker to suggest the camera had begun recording. Eventually, a faint glow illuminated the frame, a single overhead bulb, swaying gently on its cord. The studio came into view in fragments, edges emerging from the dark as though remembered rather than recorded. Then the music began. It crackled faintly, distorted like a phonograph, submerged in water. The melody moved in a key that didn't belong to any scale Cal recognized. It resembled a lullaby, but its cadence refused resolution. Each note strained against the next, evoking not peace, but unease. The camera began to pan, not with the halting motion of a faulty tripod or the twitch of mechanical tracking, but with eerie precision, sweeping across the room as if guided by an invisible hand. It turned toward the far wall where the puppets had assembled themselves in a rigid line. There were 12. They stood with their strings hanging limp, heads slightly bowed, arms at their sides. Mr. Wiggles stood at the center, his frame taller, now. Cal noticed the puppet's limbs had changed. The arms appeared longer than he had carved them, the wrists too narrow, the legs stretched unnaturally. The cracks in the porcelain face had deepened, and something faintly metallic shimmered inside one of them, pulsing in time with the warped lullaby. The puppets began to move. At first, only a twitch. Then, a fluid, coordinated motion spread through the group. Their arms rose in near-perfect unison, their heads lifted. Each puppet executed a series of gestures, kneeling, turning, lifting their hands toward the ceiling, as though performing a ritual long rehearsed and never fully understood. The camera pulled back. A chair now stood in the middle of the room. Cal was already in it. His wrists had been bound with marionette wire. His ankles were secured to the chair's legs. A crude rig forced his mouth open, mimicking the jaw mechanism he used in his older designs. He didn't move. He didn't resist. His body sat slumped beneath the light, as still as the puppets had once been. The Cal watching from the other side of the screen hardly breathed. Mr. Wiggles stepped forward. The puppet's movements were calculated. It raised one hand, and the others followed. Together the puppets encircled the chair and reached toward the man bound within it. Then everything stopped. The music ended mid-note, cut off as if someone had pinched the sound from the air. The bulb above the chair flickered once. A second passed. Then it burst. The screen went black. Cal blinked and found himself sitting on the edge of his bed. He had no memory of leaving the studio. The room around him was undisturbed. The camcorder was gone. The flash drive too. Only the monitor remained, flickering with the last frozen frame of the footage. His own face, captured just before the bulb had shattered. The image was warped by lens distortion, his mouth forced wide, his eyes glassy and unblinking, reflecting a terror he hadn't felt until just now. He stood slowly and turned toward the hallway. The puppets had gathered. They lined the corridor, facing inward like mourners at a wake. Their heads were lowered, their hands hung at their sides. The overhead lights flickered, and each time the brightness dimmed, he felt their positions had shifted. Only slightly, just enough to alter the shape of their shadows. He pushed open the studio door. The chair stood empty, but in its place someone else was waiting. A full-sized puppet now occupied the center of the room. It wore one of Cal's flannel shirts, the same paint-stained one he'd worn the day before. The face, though clearly carved from wood, had been modeled after his own features with unsettling precision. The eyes were painted, yet they appeared deeper than they should have been, layered as if something could look back out through them. He took a step forward almost against his will. The puppet raised a hand. Cal stopped. It moved toward him, not with mechanical stiffness, but with a disturbing grace. Each step was purposeful. The limbs bent exactly as they should have. When it reached him, it extended its hand again, this time offering something. A match. Cal accepted it. He looked around the room, only now registering the heavy scent in the air. Varnish. Lamp oil. A bottle lay overturned near the workbench, its contents already soaked into the floorboards. The puppet stepped back and waited. Cal struck the match. The flame bloomed in his hand, flickering softly. He hesitated. The puppet did not. It reached toward the fire, pressing its fingers against the wee flame. The match flared brightly, then dropped to the floor. The oil ignited instantly. Flame surged outward, crawling along the grain of the wood and up the curtains. The desk caught quickly. So did the racks of cloth and the crates of finished parts. The heat grew with each breath he took, filling the studio with shifting shadows and orange light. He backed away from the blaze, but the hallway was no longer clear. The puppets had closed ranks. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, blocking the exit. Their heads remained bowed, their presence unwavering. Cal turned back toward the studio. The chair had returned. The puppet now sat in it. He could see the paint melting across its face, the cracks widening in the porcelain veneer. One eye had already begun to run, black lines dripping like ink across the carved cheek. Still it smiled. He opened his mouth and screamed. Janine returned the next morning. She knocked twice before trying the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air carried the scent of char and melted plastic, but no smoke lingered. Nothing had burned. The walls were clean. The curtains were intact. There were no signs of fire at all. She opened the studio door. The puppets sat quietly along the walls, each one carefully placed. Nothing moved. A small card rested on the workbench beside a box of matches and a cracked porcelain button. Janine picked it up. The card read, "Thank you for attending tonight's performance. The Marionette hour will return when called." She turned slowly toward the chair in the center of the room. A new puppet had taken its place there. It wore a flannel shirt. Its face was carved in perfect likeness. Only the smile was different, too wide, too knowing. Mr. Wiggles sat beside it, his porcelain head resting gently on the puppet's shoulder. Janine stepped back and closed the door behind her. She did not return, but the lights never turned off again.